Hello everybody and welcome to this evening's ZSL Science and Conservation event. My name is Charlotte and I'll be your host for tonight's event. This evening we're going to be discussing putting reptiles on the map, ZSL Science for reptilian conservation. But before we meet our first speaker, I'd just like to run through a few ways that you can be involved in tonight's event. To do this, I'm going to share my screen with you all, so that you can see how you can ask questions as we go along through tonight's event. So we are taking questions in two different ways tonight. One is via Pigeonhole. So all you need to do is go to the website www.pigeonhole.at/1826. That's www.pigeonhole.at/1826. And there you'll be able to submit your questions for tonight's speakers, and we will try and cover as many as we can. One nice thing about Pigeonhole as well is that you can upvote other people's questions. So if someone's already asked the question that you would like to ask, please do upvote it so we can see what you're all dying to know, and we will try and answer those questions first and prioritize them. Another way you can ask questions this evening is by email. So simply send us an email to scientific.events@zsl.org. That's scientific.events@zsl.org. And again, we will try and answer as many of those as we can throughout the event. We are going to be asking you to fill out a survey at the end of the event. We really value your feedback. This is our third online event, and we hope that everyone's enjoying them. But if there are things that you think we could improve, perhaps different subjects you would like to see us covering in the future, then the feedback survey is the way to let us know. So as you can see, I'm sharing a link for that now, but I will be sharing that again at the end of the event. So I believe that's, let me just double check. Yep, all of our housekeeping for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. We have got 4 fantastic speakers lined up for you tonight. We're going to be hearing from each of them and giving you the opportunity to ask them questions in between. And the first person we're going to be hearing from tonight is Dr. Monika Böhm. Moni is a research fellow at ZSL's Institute of Zoology and a self-proclaimed taxonomic jack of all trades. Originally from a mammal ecology background, don't judge her, her more recent research interest has focused on the extinction risk and threats to understudied and often underappreciated biodiversity, such as freshwater mollusks, dung beetles, and reptiles. This evening, Moni will be talking about building the scientific knowledge base for reptile conservation. Moni, over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen. Thanks for the lovely introduction, Charlotte. I forgot that I put in my notes that I'm a taxonomic jack of all trades. So that made me laugh. Thank you for joining us this evening to celebrate several things. First of all, of course, one of my favorite taxonomic groups of them all, reptiles, a wonderfully diverse and fascinating group of species. Secondly, some of the major achievements that we have made over the past decade to put this incredible group of species on the conservation map. And last, but by no means least, also the many wonderful and dedicated people who have made these achievements possible and who are still working tirelessly to protect and educate about reptiles around the world. Now, in this talk, I will start by setting the scene really for this event and briefly summarize how we have come to build the scientific knowledge base for reptiles, specifically through what seemed like a never-ending cycle of assessing species and publishing about assessments and repeating this. I will highlight how ZSL has contributed to the scientific knowledge base, but of course, as I already said, there are many, many players in this story, from collaborators and other organizations that have helped to shape reptile conservation to what it is now. So first of all, what are reptiles? So when we think of reptiles, we think of these guys here in the picture, right? So on the left, we have the snakes and the lizards, the order Squamata or the squamate reptiles, plus, of course, top right there, turtles and tortoises and the crocs. There's also one other living group of reptiles, the Tuatara, with just one living species found in New Zealand. Now, I'll let Rikki talk a little bit more about what reptiles are later on. How many of these reptiles are there? Well, currently there are more than 11,000 species of reptiles known to science. And if you can see this little chart on the left, if this represents all 11,000 odd species of reptiles, and the vast majority of them are lizards, around 7,000 species of them, followed by snakes. And then, yes, there are the turtles and crocodiles and the single species of Tuatara, which doesn't even show up on this chart. Now, the number of species that we know about, that varies depending on which database you're looking at. So the IUCN Red List, for example, currently lists around 11,100 species. The reptile database from which these data here are taken lists about 11,300 species. But what we do know is that over the past years, here on this little graph in the bottom right-hand corner, since 2008, the number of species that we know has rapidly increased from around 8,700 in 2008 to now the more than 11,000 species. And that really puts reptiles very much on par with birds, which also have just over 11,000 species of birds described. So reptiles are important components of the world's ecosystems, both as predators and prey and herbivores, and some are seed dispersers, and some even function as really important pollinators. But for me personally, I think reptiles are just simply amazing because they're reptiles. The sheer diversity in shape, in color, and amazing adaptations that come with it. So, for example, from some of the smallest, so this here is the desperate leaf chameleon, which is one of the smallest species of reptile. This one actually measures no more than 3 centimeters from snout to vent, so excluding the tail. I hear it's called desperate, not because it actually lays these huge eggs in relation to its body size, but more sadly because of the desperate situation that its native forest habitat in Madagascar is under. Then you get the true giants, things like the saltwater crocodile here, for example, where males can reach lengths of up to 6 meters or so. You get snakes that actually look more like earthworms. So this Madagascar blind snake, for example, snakes like this essentially spend their time bulldozing through soil. And that's what they're built for. And you also get some species that clearly like to look like snakes. And also, I think this literally is one of the best faces in the animal world. You get some real-life Godzillas, like the Chinese crocodile lizard on the left, real-life dragons, like the Komodo dragon on the right, the largest living monitor lizard, and of course also species you can see here at London Zoo as well. And this is barely touching the surface. I mean, we're just looking at a few of my favorite species here. The interesting thing about reptiles, or the thing that kind of really got me into it, was that our conservation knowledge of reptiles has really been lagging massively behind what we know about birds, mammals, and even amphibians. I went back to what I can only call the archives, because I had to look through quite a lot of files to find this table from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species being arguably one of the world's most authoritative and comprehensive data sources on species extinction risk. And this is a table from 2008. And here we can really see that in 2008, we only knew we only had the number of species evaluated for reptiles was about 15% of the species we knew at the time. At the same time, things like mammals, like birds, and even amphibians were pretty much comprehensively assessed, birds and mammals comprehensively, and amphibians about 98%. So we really didn't know how reptiles were doing and even where they were occurring in space, for example. What's the distribution like? And that's pretty much when three very major projects also started happening kind of alongside each other, and they have helped to put this right. The first one is the Global Reptile Assessment. Now that's as it says on the tin, an assessment that tries to evaluate the extinction risk for all species of reptiles for the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And this is led by IUCN, by Conservation International and NatureServe, together with a vast host of other organizations, and ZSL has also taken part in this. It's to be completed in 2021. So if at the moment you look at the IUCN Red List, you'll see that nearly 8,000 species are actually listed on there. The second one is the sampled Red List Index for reptiles that was led by ZSL, and I'll talk more about this in a second. And the third one is the Global Assessment of Reptile Distributions, a massive project as well, led by Tel Aviv University and Oxford University, with the aim really of mapping the distribution of all reptile species in the world. So with the Global Reptile Assessment set to complete in 2021, let's focus here now on the sampled Red List Index for reptiles. First of all, why was this needed when we look all those years back? Well, the IUCN Red List Index is a major biodiversity indicator that is used to assess progress that we make towards biodiversity policy targets like those set by the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example. And this is derived from the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. And the Red List Index really works for those species groups for which comprehensive assessments have been carried out, so for which all species or nearly all species have been assessed. So at the time of reporting in 2010, for example, on the 2010 biodiversity target, that was things like, as you can see on the left, the birds, the mammals, the amphibians, and then also the corals for which there had been a comprehensive assessment produced in 2008. But of course, to allow a broader coverage of more species groups in the Red List Index, colleagues of mine here at ZSL led the development of the sampled Red List Index. And what their idea was that in order to include more species groups in the Red List Index, particularly for highly species-rich groups like the reptiles, like the fish, many invertebrates, and also plants, we need to assess a sample of species which is large enough to give an accurate depiction of what the overall trend of the Red List Index for that group would be, while also being feasible to carry out the assessments. And so based on some analysis they did on those species groups that were comprehensively assessed at the time, so birds and amphibians, they came up with a sample size of 1,500 species. And this sample size was then applied to several groups that you can see in this schematic here. They're generally those that are marked with an asterisk, because these are the groups that are actually quite numerous in terms of number of species, and of course include the reptiles. And so this assessment process for the sampled Red List Index then ran alongside the IUCN Global Reptile Assessment, as I already mentioned. So this sampled assessment of reptiles really gave us the first ever overview of what the conservation status of the world's reptiles is like. So one of the main results of this, and that was quite often found in the media as well around that time of the publication, was that around 1 in 5 species in our sample were threatened with extinction. So it usually came with this beautiful picture of this beautiful lizard from Sri Lanka. Now, the IUCN categories here on these figures are shown from dark and light green for least concern and near threatened to the threatened categories of vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered. They're the ones where it turns from yellow into orange and red. And note that none of our species was listed as extinct. So we don't have any extinct species in this sample in 2013 when it was published. Now, the number of species assessed as data deficient, you can see in these figures in the gray. Data deficient means we do not know what their true extinction risk is due to a lack of data. Now, so this was the first time we could say something about the red list status of reptiles. So we could say that around 1 in 5 reptiles were struggling to survive. We could say that turtles, for example, as you can see here, were doing much worse than snakes and lizards. Yes, crocodiles also did quite badly, but of course this is based on a very, very small sample. We could see that in many areas of the tropics, like the Afrotropics, for example, extinction risk was a lot higher, in the neotropics as well. and that our knowledge, for example, on the status of species was particularly bad in many ways in the Indo-Malayan realm, where we had a lot of data deficiency, whereas in the Arctic realm, for example, we knew quite a lot about species. We could also look at how different species and different systems were doing. So freshwater and marine species, primarily because of the freshwater turtles, were actually doing quite badly in our sample and were much more threatened than terrestrial species. And for anything that bulldozes its way through the soil, for example, or the leaf litter and the subsurface, generally we don't tend to know much about it, and they were highly data deficient. So with this assessment, of course, came lots of other analyses as well. We had a first look at what the distribution of our sample looked like, and also what the most prominent threats were to our species. But what really got me about this assessment was that it really brought together the work of a large number of different people, 245 co-authors to be precise. Most of them were our reptile assessors. And so without these guys, this project would have been absolutely nothing. It would have not been possible. I know very little about reptiles, and so we were really relying on the knowledge of these guys to get to this status. So big shout out to everybody who was involved. So that's the sampled red list index. Another really ambitious project, of course, was the global assessment of reptile distributions, which is still ongoing, but we have got results of what reptile distributions look like throughout the world. It's just that these maps can always be refined as we go on. Think about what an enormous challenge this was. So this project started, led, as I said, by Tel Aviv University and Oxford University in 2006. And remember, before 2010, we knew of fewer than 9,000 species of reptiles. Now it's more than 11,000. So a huge project that kind of kept on growing and kept on giving. And again, many people involved in this. And these are the main results, really, at least from the point of view of tonight's talk. And that's if you look at these four panels. The top left panel is the species richness of reptiles globally, where we can see patterns that are very similar to some of the other groups of tetrapods like amphibians and mammals. The top right looks slightly different. That's the lizards. And there you can see that there's massive hotspots of reptile richness in Australia, including in the interior of this really hot continent. And then snakes in the bottom left, and turtles again in the bottom right. So for the first time, really, we knew where reptiles were occurring in the world, what their general distribution pattern was like. And that, of course, means that for the first time, we can start looking at spatial conservation priorities for this group. Where are most reptiles, for example? Where might we want to look out for placing conservation measures and so on? And the resultant data has also underpinned a lot of research into macroecology, so understanding these patterns of distribution. So we're starting to get this idea of reptile distribution and how threatened they are with extinction. But of course, what we're still really after is what about trends over time? So at the moment, we're busy working on a publication to show the trend in the sampled red list index for reptiles over time, which we hope to be released in 2021. But in the meantime, we thought, what about the second biodiversity indicator that we're working on here at ZSL, the Living Planet Index? What does that show for reptiles? Now, a quick recap, the Living Planet Index uses abundance data over time, so population time series data from monitored vertebrate populations from across the globe to produce an indicator or an index value of vertebrate population trends over time. Now, the results of this are reported every other year in the Living Planet report. 2020 was one of those report years, and it showed that there was an average decline of 68% in monitored vertebrate populations since 1970. For reptiles, though, we have much less data available on population trends. So at the top of this slide, you can see the IUCN Red List criteria quickly summarized, and these are the criteria that we use to assess species. So the two criteria contributing most to our sampled Red List assessment are criterion B and criterion D, actually D2. And these are actually criteria that are based on aspects of the geographic distribution of species. So 84% of those threatened species overall in our sample were assessed based on their distribution. assessments using criterion A and C are much less used, and these require some idea of population reductions over time. So that's data that is that's probably at most available for turtles or crocodiles, for example, but for most species, we have no idea. And so this is reflected in the Living Planet database. We had a master student, Anwesha Saha, with us, who took on the task to investigate the feasibility of a Living Planet index for reptiles. And the image on the bottom right is taken from her project and shows the coverage of reptile species in the Living Planet database out of the number of species described. So you can see really where we get something grayed in. That's where we have some coverage in the database. And you can pretty much see that if you look at the top bar total, at the time we only had about 194 species in the whole database, mostly crocs, mostly turtles and tortoises, so chelonians, and yes, the tuatara was also represented.
1 minute, Moni.
Thanks. So the squamates were vastly underrepresented. Now, Mimi did a great job including more data into the database, and then this year we finally managed to add a Living Planet index for reptiles to this year's Living Planet report. As you can see, still only representing 227 species, so there's still a lot more work to do, but what it showed was that on average there was a 31% decline in global monitored reptile populations. And the reptiles were even on the title page of the report, so it's a double win all around. So just to wrap up, we have come a long way in terms of building our knowledge base for reptile ecology and conservation alongside the projects I have just talked about. We've seen many, many studies appear in recent years, some of them as direct spin-offs of these larger projects. For example, studies on reptiles and their spatial patterns, so macroecology, especially from the GARD group. Things like regional assessments. So here, for example, an example from Australia, generally going hand in hand with a global reptile assessment. Ways in which we can improve red list assessments. What are the data gaps that we need to fill for reptiles? And also how can we use machine learning, for example, to overcome data deficiency in reptiles? More detailed analysis on threats to reptiles. So what about global trade? What about climate change and so on? And even into going into public perception of reptiles using Wikipedia page views, for example, and trying to figure out what the most popularly looked up reptiles are. And a lot more phylogenetic research, but I leave that for Rikki to describe. And so really what's next? Keep an eye out next year for when we will finally, hopefully, fingers crossed, publish a trend in the SRLI over time, all the way from 1990 to 2020. And when we will hopefully have the full picture of extinction risk in reptiles because of the conclusion of the global reptile assessment. And then hopefully finally see reptiles fully represented in global conservation planning. That's the ultimate aim. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Moni. A quick reminder to anyone who's watching, there are two ways to ask our speakers your questions this evening. One is to go to pigeonhole.at/1826 and type in your question there. The other way is to send us an email to scientific.events@zsl.org, and we'll be taking a few questions for each speaker after they've each spoken this evening. Which brings me back to you, Moni. Thank you for a fantastic introductory presentation there. We've had lots of questions flooding through on Pigeonhole. The most popular one at the moment, I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, but I'm going to ask anyway, because it's asking about the role of citizen science in helping to put reptiles on the map. And I'm not sure whether you've had any involvement yourself in any citizen science projects or are aware of any that are helping our understanding of reptiles and perhaps feeding into some of the work that you've described.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk about citizen science generally in trying to help us understand more about biodiversity trends overall. As you already rightly said, I personally have not been involved in any of those, but I think maybe some of the other speakers tonight might be able to point out some of these programs. From my experience, a lot of the citizen science programs that I've heard about are still kind of focusing primarily on some of the better known species, because they're generally quite reliant on something that's easy to identify in the field. So yeah, I really...
Brilliant. Well, we'll see if any of the other speakers can comment on that one and might come back to it later on. Meanwhile, Moni, the second most popular question, I think you're going to like this one, is which is your favorite species of freshwater turtle? Do you have one?
Oh, I thought it was like, which is your favorite species of reptiles? And I was about to shout out the Komodo dragon because it's a giant monitor lizard, and I love monitor lizards. I think in terms of freshwater turtles, and I think it will feature in some of the talks later on, there's an amazing species from, I think, Australia, which essentially has some algae or something growing on its head and looks like it's wearing a mohawk. And it's just one of the coolest images I've ever seen. Also, and again, I don't want to spoil it. Later on, there will be a hint at one of my favorite turtle facts, I believe, as well. So keep an eye out for that. Or an ear out.
Okay, final question for you, Moni, before we move on. Why do you think there were previously so few reptile assessments? Do you know why this might be?
I mean, I think originally, really, our whole focus in conservation has pretty much started from some big creatures down to smaller and smaller things, right? And so I think with some of the what we might call slightly more obscure groups, we're only just now kind of catching up. And so really mammals, and I mean, even the global mammal assessment hasn't happened until about 2008 when it was published. So there were global assessments of mammals done beforehand under the old criteria, but again, you know, the first proper quantified, I can't say that word, I should really know how to say that as a scientist, really difficult, has only happened not that long ago. And so birds really are the ones that we know most about. So I think it's just a reflection of this, and also trying to bring more people into this network of people who try and do these assessments for species, I think has just taken a little bit longer to catch on in things like invertebrates and also reptiles and fish, for example.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Moni, and thank you to all of you for your questions so far. Do keep sending them in. We will try and cover as many as we can during the event. Now, our second speaker this evening is Rikki Gumbs. Rikki is a research scientist at ZSL's Edge of Existence programme with a passion for reptile conservation. Rikki is responsible for developing EDGE species lists, which prioritise evolutionarily unique species for conservation action. And he has overseen several of EDGE's conservation projects on threatened reptiles worldwide. He is currently in the process of completing his PhD at Imperial College London. This evening, Rikki is going to be discussing reptiles on the edge, conservation priorities for the reptilian tree of life. Rikki, over to you.
Thanks, Charlotte. Hope you all can hear me. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I've shared my screen, so that should be good. As Charlotte said, I research how we can prioritize the tree of life for conservation action. And I'm going to give you a very quick fire zoom through our research over the past 5 or so years at ZSL, really trying to do this for the reptilian tree of life for the first time. So I guess the best place to start is why do we care about conserving the tree of life? Well, in its purest form, biodiversity is simply the variety of life. And the tree of life provides us with a very useful tool to measure this variety between species and within species that goes beyond simply counting up of species numbers. And this is because the amazing diversity that we see around the world today, when we look around, you know, we have different behaviors of species, the way species look, and the unique genetic diversity of species is linked to the unique evolutionary history these species share and the evolutionary history of all life on Earth. And we have a tree here of reptiles and species with more unique evolutionary history, such as the gharial here, and with its long red branch, which it has all to itself. They also tend to be more unique and distinctive in how they look and how they behave. So therefore, the extinction of one of these highly distinctive species alone on a long branch of the tree of life, such as the gharial here, can often represent a greater loss of biodiversity than the loss of a species on a shorter branch, say with numerous close relatives that are all very relatively similar to one another, such as our little crocodile here on the golden branch. There's lots of similar relatives. And recently there's evidence to suggest that safeguarding the tree of life is one of the most effective strategies we have to secure the benefits of nature for society and humans, not only currently, but for future generations too. So what do we now know about the reptilian tree of life that we didn't know before? Well, as Moni alluded to earlier, first, it's probably important to outline what we mean when we talk about reptiles and the reptilian tree of life. As you may be aware, the idea of a reptile itself in the classic sense is quite outdated. As you can see here, birds, represented by the pink branches, actually sit right in the middle of what we would call classic reptiles. And crocodilians and turtles are actually more closely related to birds in evolutionary terms than they are to lizards and snakes. But here we're not going to talk about the feathery flying reptiles, birds, and we're going to focus on, the traditional and much more cool and important reptiles, the crocodilians, turtles, lizards, snakes, and the tuatara. And the third thing we wanted to know about the reptilian tree of life with our research was a very simple question: just how much evolutionary history is there across the group? And as Moni pointed out earlier, reptiles are very species rich, and this is reflected in what we see in their evolutionary history. And even though they kind of mirror birds in the number of species, they actually embody a lot more unique evolutionary history, the most evolutionary history of any of the terrestrial vertebrate groups, though the very evolutionary diverse amphibians aren't far behind. And then naturally, following this, once we'd estimated how much evolutionary history reptiles embodied, we then set out to quantify how much of this evolutionary history was at risk of extinction. And what we found has been staggering, if not too surprising. When we look at lizards and snakes, we see that the amount of the tree of life we stand to lose, around 12%, is somewhat comparable to that of birds, mammals, and a bit less than what we see for highly threatened amphibians. However, when we look at crocodilians and turtles, we see a very different picture. They both face the loss of around 2/5 of their entire evolutionary history, given current estimates of extinction risk. And given that we still lack a lot of data around the extinction risk of reptiles, we can be quite confident that this is a significant underestimation of the total threat to the reptilian tree of life, and it's probably much, much higher. And when we put this potential loss of reptilian diversity into raw numbers, it becomes pretty incomprehensible. For any of you with a keen interest in cosmology, you might recognize this image, which is one of the remnants of the radiation from the early universe. So why is this in a talk about reptiles? Well, if we were to take each branch of the reptilian tree of life that is at risk of extinction and lay them end to end back through time in one straight line, we would actually be back at the beginning of the universe. More than 13 billion years of reptilian evolutionary history is at risk of being lost. So these numbers are absolutely mind-boggling. So now we know how much of the tree of life of reptiles is at risk, a lot. What can we do to avert the worst of these losses? Well, the approach we use, especially at ZSL, to identify the most important species for conservation is the EDGE prioritization approach. And EDGE species are those species that are highly evolutionarily unique, and they have few or no close relatives on the tree of life, and also they are at high risk of extinction. And we use the evolutionary uniqueness and extinction risk of these species to rank them for conservation action. So the more unique you are and the more threatened you are, the higher you rank as a priority for conservation action. And these EDGE lists were first pioneered by ZSL scientists in the mid-2000s for the world's mammals, and then were quickly followed by EDGE lists for amphibians, birds, and even corals. And it was only much later, in 2018, that we were able to finally create such a prioritization for the world's reptiles. And this is following huge advances, as Moni spoke about earlier, in our understanding not only of how many species of reptile there were, but how those species are related and how threatened a lot of those species are. So when we compared the evolutionary uniqueness of individual reptile species with that of amphibians, birds, and mammals, we saw that reptiles and especially turtles, were very evolutionarily unique compared to other groups, especially average turtles. And here we have on the right, you'll see the pig-nosed turtle, the most evolutionary unique species of turtle. These species represent hundreds of millions of years of unique evolutionary history. And even with the lizards and snakes and tuatara, which tend to be less unique on average than your turtles or crocodilians or amphibians, species like the tuatara here, which sits on its own branch of the tree of life, is incredibly evolutionarily unique, the most unique of all terrestrial vertebrates. And its branch that it shares, that it shares with no other species, is actually nearly 250 million years old. And when we combine this evolutionary uniqueness data with extinction risk data for reptiles, we again see that reptiles are incredibly important priorities for conservation. Turtles and crocodilians, again, in particular, have the greatest edge scores, and that even the highest ranking snake or lizard, Moni also showed a picture of possibly my favorite reptile, the Madagascar blind snake here at the bottom. This has a greater edge score, is a higher edge priority than any other amphibian, bird or mammal that we assessed. So what we can surmise from this is edge reptiles are highly irreplaceable, they're highly threatened, and the loss of these species, the amount of evolutionary history they represent, would be unparalleled losses of terrestrial vertebrate biodiversity. However, there are many species of reptile actually overlooked by the edge approach. And this is because more than 1/3 of reptiles currently lack sufficient extinction risk data. And this precludes them from any prioritization which needs this information. So to try and overcome this, we therefore map the evolutionary history of the world's reptiles using the data from the data which Moni showed earlier. So we mapped the branches of the tree of life to find out where the greatest amounts of this unique evolutionary history were found on Earth and where it was represented by highly distinctive species. And when we had those areas, the colored grid cells here on the map, we then overlapped them with areas of the planet currently experiencing the most intense levels of human pressure. These are areas in the orange and red here. You see them, they span from Central America and the Caribbean through to Southern Africa, Madagascar, the Western Ghats, and into Southeast Asia. Worryingly, as you can see, these high pressure areas absolutely dominate the important regions for reptilian evolutionary history. So what we did is we used the extent of this human pressure across the ranges of the most distinctive species to try and identify priorities for conservation where formal extinction risk data were lacking currently. And what we found again was rather worrying. We found that over half of all of the most evolutionarily unique and threatened species are impacted by human pressure, high levels of human pressure, currently lack sufficient conservation knowledge. And these species are very unique. They represent more than 500 million years of unique evolutionary history. And when we compared them to species that are threatened, which also are similarly unique and under intense human pressure, the same levels of human pressure, we saw that these tend to be higher ranking than species. So this tells us these species, which we don't know much about their conservation status, but they occur in these areas under high pressure, are actually potentially very at risk of extinction. However, it's not all doom and gloom. Prioritizing the reptilian, yep. Okay, I'm guessing it's a backup. Prioritizing the reptilian tree of life goes beyond just publishing this research. ZSL, it has an edge of existence program, which uses these lists to inform applied conservation efforts on the ground through our EDGE fellows. And we'll see more about the EDGE fellows coming up shortly, but they, for reptiles, already have almost 20 projects around the world working to do things such as finding new populations and even reintroducing species into protected areas. And hopefully there's a lot more of this to come in 2021 and beyond. Yeah, thank you for that quick whiz through, and thank you to everyone who's been involved in it all. I'll hand back to Charlotte now.
Thank you so much, Rikki. No easy feat to take us through all of that, but a brilliant introduction to EDGE and to the reptiles in particular that you're working with. We've had some more questions come through, which is fantastic. If you have a question for a specific speaker, do feel free to sort of put at the beginning who you would like us to direct it to, because actually I'm going to be a little bit sneaky here, and there's a question which is very popular. It's referring to Moni's presentation, but I think probably probably, Rikki, you're in a position to be able to answer it. But if you can't, don't worry, just say, we'll go back to Moni. And the question is, what are the most common threats for reptiles categorized as threatened? But I guess for all of those, unfortunately, many species of reptile that are threatened, what are the main risks? Why are they at risk?
So habitat loss is probably the major driver that we see for the loss of reptiles, especially species that are very sensitive to change in their habitat. You know, they might be forest specialists. So the conversion of land for agriculture and human development, but also the pet trade is another one that we've seen, which is a major driver in certain areas, especially in Asia and Africa, of driving species towards extinction.
Brilliant, thank you. Also, we've got a couple of other questions here relating to your talk. So we've got a question here. I don't know how quickly you can answer this one, but it's how are evolutionary uniqueness and extinction threat weighted when determining edge ranking? Now, does that all come down to a lot of maths, or?
I can give it a quite quick answer. So the original edge metric, which we use, was designed to weight them both as evenly as possible. So what we see is that the way we weight extinction risk, which uses the red list data, weighs roughly around the same in the analyses that we do as the branches of the tree of life, which we use to measure the species. So it's quite equal weighting in the way we try to do it.
Brilliant. I'm going to squeeze one more in, because this one is especially for you, Rikki. Isn't there a bias in the crocodile and turtle evolutionary uniqueness just because they have much fewer species than squamates?
Exactly. So what we see is that even though the groups are terribly threatened, so 67%, I think, of turtles are threatened with extinction or actually already extinct, and 50% of crocodilians. When you have such small numbers of species compared to lizards and snakes, there are many branches of the tree of life to be messing around with. So losing 2 or 3 species can actually lead to losing, you know, incredible amounts of these internal branches of the tree of life, which will be lost forever.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, you mentioned Edge Fellows earlier, Rikki, and we have got a special treat for everyone watching this evening.
Yeah, so we have a video here, which has been made by a few of our Edge Fellows to highlight some of the work they're doing around the world to save some of the most amazing species.
Fantastic. I've just realised I started sharing that without putting the sound on. So I'm going to try again and put the sound on, because it will be a lot more enjoyable if you can hear what everyone is saying.
Hola amigos, my name is Liliana Saboya. I'm from Colombia, and I'm working with the Colombian dwarf gecko Lepidoliphoris millatai.
Vanakkam, I'm Jailabdin. I'm from India. I'm working on gharials, which are critically endangered crocodilian, endemic to Indian subcontinent.
Namaste, my name is Ayushi Jain and I am from India. I'm working with an extraordinary species of freshwater turtle called Cantor's giant softshell turtle.
Hello, 大家好. I'm Jonathan from Malaysia. I work on green turtles, scientifically known as Chelonia midas.
My aim is to study the natural history and secure the habitat of gharial in Chambal River, which is the stronghold population of gharial in the world.
My aim is to generate information on population parameters of this species in order to establish priority monitoring areas with community and institutions inside and outside protected areas.
My aim with this project is to collect baseline information on its ecology to work towards its conservation with an active involvement of the local communities in Kerala.
The main threat for gharials are habitat loss due to river fragmentation because of building dams, reservoirs, etc. And also there is a pressure from sand mining as well as unsustainable fishing or illegal fishing too.
My aim is to protect them at their foraging ground from threats caused by the fisheries and also tour activities. The main threats of green turtles are intentional harvesting of their eggs and also unintentional bycatch from the fisheries industries.
This turtle is highly threatened due to the destruction of its habitat and exploitation for its meat.
The main threats to my species is habitat loss due to activities like cattle, agriculture, and uncontrolled tourism.
One of the most interesting facts about turtles that I learned fairly recently in my life was that few turtles can actually breathe from their butt. Yes, their butt.
I'm working on acoustic communications of gharials as my PhD project, through which we identified that big gharial males having gara have a unique popping signal through which he can show his identity as well as his individuality to other females as well as other males.
My favorite sea turtle fact is that unlike humans, the gender of the sea turtle are actually dependent on the temperature of the sand before they hatch. High temperature resulted to most hatchlings being females and vice versa.
Lepidoplephorus type is probably the smallest gecko in my country, and I think that is one of the smallest geckos even in the world. Maybe it's in the top 10 of the smallest geckos in the world. I think so. Lizards in the world. And in some area, this species is really abundant, and we think that they played an important role in all the dynamics that occur in the leaf litter of the tropical dry forest.
There are many reasons as to why we should care about the conservation of reptiles, but there's not even a single reason of why we shouldn't. Apart from their extremely important ecological role, we hold the responsibility to do all the damage control we as humans have done for centuries.
We should conserve these animals because they are some of the very oldest creatures on Earth, and their presence can be dated back to 120 million years ago during the time of the dinosaurs. They are tough animals, but unfortunately, they are now endangered because of human activities. That is why we need to save them before they're extinct. Thank you.
Why should people care about reptiles? I like to explain this with a small story. Reptiles are like rain. When rain comes, people don't want to go out and get wet, but rain is really essential for every life in the world. Likewise, reptiles, they might look weird, and some of them are venomous, some of them are they are so ugly when people think about it, but they play a vital role in our ecosystem.
Well, there we go. A few important words from some of our ZSL Edge fellows. I'm particularly like thinking of reptiles like rain. We have just heard from some of our current fellows. We're about to hear from one of our previous fellows because our third speaker tonight is Emmanuel Amoah. Emmanuel is the Executive Director of the Threatened Species Conservation Alliance, a Ghanaian NGO dedicated to nature conservation. Emmanuel is currently pursuing a PhD degree with a research focus on West African slender-snouted crocodiles. He is an alumnus of the ZSL Edge Fellowship and the first recipient of the Segre Species Survival Award. Now, Emmanuel's presentation is pre-recorded this evening, so we're going to play that, but Emmanuel will then be available for questions afterwards, so please do send them in.
Hi, good evening to you all. I bring you greetings from Ghana. I'm very excited to join you tonight for tonight's event. My name is Emmanuel Amoah, as I've already been introduced. In the next 10 minutes, I will highlight on some of the interesting things we've been doing in Ghana about community-led crocodile conservation so far. And so as a way of introduction, I will talk a bit of background into conservation of natural resources using traditional means. I'll highlight on some of the things that we have done in the Tano River so far, the threats identified, and way forward. We also highlight some of the recommendations we think that going forward we should adopt in helping to protect the species. and conservation as a whole. And so if you look at the history of Africa, traditional protection of the environment has existed for ages. And before the arrival of Europeans, Africans has their own way of protecting their environment. And so indigenous people use various means, including taboos. Now, taboos are prohibited activities that are formed as a result of local culture, and it basically prevents people from doing certain things in a certain community. Now, if you look at Ghana, we have taboo days, and these are the days that people don't go to the farms, they don't go to the sea for fishing. And these are some of the ways our local people use in minimizing pressure on our natural resources. Now we have totems. Now totems are mostly animals and plants that are associated with families and clans, and these are used as a symbolic value for the various families. And so in doing that, they help to protect these very symbols. So for instance, if a family has lion as its symbol, they give all the respect and they work towards the protection of lions. If family has crocodiles, they don't eat crocodiles, they don't hunt crocodiles. And in a way, this helps to minimize pressure on natural resources. The existence of superstitious belief, for instance, people fear that going to the forest alone in the night, you might encounter some spiritual attacks. And so people do not have the courage in the past to go to the forest in the night to cut trees like it is happening now. And these are some of the things they did to control human behavior. It is interesting to note that even though such norms were not written down, they were successfully transferred from one generation to the other. Now, through this kind of management, our locals and our indigenous were able to establish protected areas such as sacred groves, evil forests, and sacred rivers. And these are areas that people were banned from going there, or these are rivers that people were advised to treat it with the maximum respect. So going to such rivers, you are very careful. And such rivers sometimes even have rules like no harvesting of fisheries resources from them. And in a way, they help to control and protect our very natural resources that we depend on. Now, until the arrival of Europeans, we had our own way of doing things, and it was working for us. Now, in the introduction of alien forms of protection, such as national parks, forest reserves, sanctuaries, appeared alien to the people, and to date, they have struggled to identify with it, and they have struggled to adjust to the principle of this foreign way of protecting our natural resources. In Ghana, there are various examples that exist on successful protection using traditional means. In fact, we have a place called Boabin-Fiema, and this place, we have monkeys that live in close proximity with human beings. The monarch monkey, the colobus, they live in close proximity, and the belief is that they are the ancestors and they will not do anything to hunt them. We have crocodile in the northern part of Ghana, where people can go and sit on them and do all sorts of interesting activities with them because they have lived in peace with them, and they believe that their ancestors are the crocodiles, and so they don't do anything to hunt them. Now, one of the things or the principle that has made this kind of protection effective is the fear of the gods. In fact, gone are the days that people fear to do things because they'll get instant justice from the gods. You do something, either you die immediately or shortly after doing that activity. So people were afraid. Unlike the foreign religious system, such as Christianity and Islam, that we believe that it's after your death before you have your punishment. So the traditional ones were more effective in controlling human behavior than now. Despite these interesting things, conservationists have not given much attention to traditional protection in Africa. Now, one of such areas that is having interesting aspect is the Tano River in Ghana. Now, this river has the slender-snouted crocodile, which I'll talk about briefly. This river is very long. It flows across 3 regions in Ghana. Now, at the upper part of the river, the people worship this river, the people respect it, and it is highly connected to their culture. There's no harvesting of fishing resources from the river in the upper parts. Now, when you go to the downstream, it's a different story. Fish are harvested, the river is polluted, and in fact, it's less worshipped in that area. And so, if you look at it, one river, upper part, we don't consume the fish, the lower part, we do. That is interesting aspect of traditional culture. In fact, evidence exists that people who have made attempt to consume fish at the upper part have suffered for it. So now, because of this kind of protection, the West African slender-snouted crocodile has benefited from it because 1, fisheries resources are available for it, and 2, people don't hunt it. So this species that is extremely rare throughout Africa, West Africa, is now relatively abundant in this very location that I'm talking about. Now, this river, as a result, holds a significant proportion of this critically endangered species. Now, the indigenous accord high level of respect to this species. When it dies, they treat it like human beings have died and they bury it, believing that it is their ancestor and they will not do anything that is not befitting to it. Now, one thing that is interesting to note is that this strict protection at the upstream only covers the river and does not extend to the immediate riparian vegetation. And so as a result, there's destruction of nesting habitat, plastic pollution is increasing, and bushfires, which mostly happen at the peak of dry season, and this is also the time that the crocodile also nests, is affecting the species long-term protection. And so as an organization, THRESCOAL as an organization, what we are doing is that we are working with all our stakeholders, including our sponsors, to one, establish a community-based crocodile sanctuary. Now, this is very important because if you don't do that, even though the people protect the river, the riparian vegetation is going, and these species depend on the riparian vegetation for nesting. So with years, even though they are not killed, they will not get a place to reproduce, and their population will eventually go down again. So we are working with locals to establish community-based protected area to minimize human activity along the catchment of the river. We are developing alternative livelihoods. So in a way, to reduce the pressure on the banks of the river, we want to find alternative jobs for the people. We are also working with locals to build their capacity in crocodile conservation. This is very important because if you don't do that and we are not there, who is going to take charge of the very resource we protect? So we are working with locals to do that. Another thing we are doing is to promote community-based ecotourism. Now, the people have done so well, protected this resource. It is up to us as conservationists to let them get benefit from it. And to do that, we intend to establish community-based ecotourism to bring economic benefit to the people. Now we are continuously working with the locals and raising awareness about the need to protect the riparian vegetation, the need to protect these very resources that they have worked so hard through their tradition to sustain up to this level. We believe that working with the locals will help us to protect this very species. Now, concluding on what I have done so far, I'm saying that in Ghana and other parts of West Africa, traditional protection presents a very powerful tool to protect natural resources, and evidence exists in this regard. Now, it is interesting to note that infiltration of foreign religion like Christianity, Islam, and others have minimized the fear that people have for the punishment of gods, and so it threatens the long-term persistence of these traditional beliefs that have thrived on the use of fear and superstitious beliefs. Now, it is important for us as conservationists to integrate the traditional protections that exist into our modern way of protecting natural resources. In that way, it becomes easier because the people are already making effort to protect it. And so working with them to protect it becomes easier. I thank you very much for your attention, and we are very grateful to all our sponsors for making this work possible. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to answer your questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much, Emmanuel, for that pre-recorded video there. I can't turn on my video at the moment, so I'll see if someone else can for me. There we go. But we have had a few questions through for you. So the first one is, do indigenous or traditional beliefs inform conservation policies nowadays in Ghana? Are you aware of any conservation policies that take these beliefs into consideration?
Thank you very much. Basically, we don't have such policies, but what is happening now is that the government...
Oh, I think we've lost your sound, Emmanuel, or at least I can't hear it. Can you try again for us?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that we don't have policies, but the government in recent years are trying to integrate local people into conservation. So what they do mostly is that trying to, for instance, if you have a national park, they work with the locals around to protect it. But as in getting specific policy, we currently do not have. Yeah, we do not have such policy. But we have areas in Ghana that the government has worked with the locals to establish community-based protected area, like I mentioned in my presentation, like the Wabin Fema Monkey Sanctuary, the Paga Crocodile Ponds, that the government has worked with the people to do it.
Brilliant. Well, that's really promising. Another question that we've got is whether traditional management of natural resources is compatible with government protection. What are your thoughts about that?
I think the two seek to do the same thing. What they are trying to do is to protect the resources. So I think it's a very compatible thing. But what we have to do is to make sure that the two parties understand each other. For instance, if you want to integrate traditional protection into government protection, make sure that their cultural rights that they perform, when the day is due, they can have access to the river to perform their right and do the ritual things that they want to do. So in that way, the locals believe that they have access to their culture, and then
your sound is breaking up a little bit, Emmanuel. I'm going to try one more question for you. We'll see how it goes, fingers crossed. What do you think should be done to promote community-led conservation?
Okay, so what I think should be done is that first and foremost, government should make effort to identify such areas because we have them within the country. So what we have to do first, the government agencies in charge of management should identify such areas. And then the second step is to engage the locals on how to protect their resources in the long term. Because for now, the traditional belief system is dying out a bit because of education, because of foreign religion. So there's a need to, first and foremost, identify the area. Then second, work with the people to establish long-term protection, like we are trying to do with the crocodiles. We know they are protected, but we want to establish a community-based protected area. So in that case, we have kind of legal protection as well as traditional protection. So even if the traditional protection dies out, the legal protection will now exist. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Emmanuel. Do stay with us because we may have some more questions for you at the end. But now we're going to hear from our final speaker tonight, which is Benjamin Tapley. Ben is the curator of reptiles and amphibians at ZSL and a PhD candidate at the University of Kent. Ben is involved in several amphibian and reptile conservation programs and is currently working on Chinese giant salamanders in China, mountain chicken frogs from the Caribbean, and megaphrid frogs and big-headed turtles in Vietnam. Ben is part of the IUCN Amphibian Specialist Group and the Vice Chair of the EASA Amphibian Taxon Advisory Group. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. I believe you're going to be discussing release strategies for confiscated and endangered big-headed turtles in Vietnam.
Thank you for the introduction, Charlotte. I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Yeah, so as the introduction stated, I generally work with amphibians, so I'm moonlighting as a reptile specialist tonight. Sorry, I'm just having this talk. I can't really begin without acknowledging the fact that this work is led by our partner organizations, the Asian Turtle Program and Indo-Myanmar Conservation. They're doing all the hard work implementing this work. So we have Ha, who is our Edge Fellow, Tim and Twee, and they're just part of a very large collaboration on this species. So 32% of the world's turtles are found in Southeast Asia. Many of these species are endemic to the region, and 78% of the turtles found there are threatened with extinction. And turtles in the region are threatened by habitat loss, but also through over-collection, non-sustainable collection for the trade in their meat, for traditional medicine, and for the exotic pet trade. And this is called the Asian turtle crisis. And huge volumes of turtles have been illegally traded. And in the early 2000s, it was estimated that up to 12 million turtles were traded per year in Asia. And this is a really, really lucrative business, estimated to be worth, the illegal wildlife trade in general, sorry, not just for turtles, is estimated to be 5 to 20 billion pounds per year. And it only it's third after the illegal trade in weapons and drugs. So a major industry. So one of the questions we have is, can animals seized from the illegal wildlife trade be released back into the wild? And there are a few things we need to consider here. One is taxonomic uncertainty. So do we know about all species and subspecies? And that many species and subspecies occurring in the region are likely to have adaptations to the local environment. Also that many turtles can potentially hybridize. So moving animals comes with a risk of, I guess, it can compromise translocations through hybridizations and the fact that individuals may not fare well in sites if they're not native to them. And the other thing we need to think about is moving any animal. You're not just moving the animal, you're moving all of the pathogens and parasites that it may contain. And this comes with a risk, not only to that species, but potentially to other species that are present at the release site. So you could be moving diseases around as well. And so there are cases where translocations or reintroduction programs have spread diseases. So Majorca midwife toads, chytrid fungus was spread to the island of Majorca when animals were released from a conservation breeding program. And then in terms of genetic issues, Chinese giant salamanders were thought to be one species historically, have been moved around China, and we now know there's multiple species, and that hybridization could potentially result in the loss of some of those species before they're even described. So these are very real issues. And with turtles, it's quite complicated because the trade routes themselves are quite complicated. So we don't know where many of the animals that are seized from the illegal wildlife trade originally come from. And this coupled with that taxonomic uncertainty and the fact when we think about diseases, we don't have any data for the pathogens that wild turtles have in Southeast Asia. And further complicating things is that because many turtles are now so threatened in Southeast Asia that North American turtles are now being traded in the region, there could be new pathogens that aren't native to the region that turtles kind of come into contact with when they're in part of these wildlife trade networks. And there's not really historically been much of a focus on looking at the genetics or the diseases and pathogens that turtles have prior to translocations when animals have been seized from the illegal wildlife trade and released back into the wild in Vietnam. So this means that many of the translocations that have occurred historically don't really meet the IUCN guidelines for reintroductions and conservation translocations. So this talk focuses on a really cool turtle, the big-headed turtle. It's native to China and mainland Southeast Asia. It's an endangered edge species. There are 3 subspecies in the region, and this turtle lives in high mountains and it needs kind of forested habitat with good water quality and cool streams. And they're also highly territorial. They fight and they don't move very large distances. They don't disperse very far. And the fact that they're restricted to one type of habitat, one linear habitat, a stream, means they're very easy to collect from the wild. Previously, this turtle was quite common. So a study from China shows that you could find up to 120 of these turtles per kilometer stretch of stream in China. But when this study was repeated 10 years later, they found that population densities had crashed even within protected areas, primarily due to overexploitation. And so we're going to be focusing on the Vietnam context now. So recently, seizures in this particular species have increased massively in Vietnam. So here's a picture from a seizure at the Turtle Conservation Center in Cuc Phuong National Park, who we partner with. And on the right, you can see some of the animals arrive in quite a bad state due to the methods used to collect them. There's a fish hook in this X-ray. And these animals that end up in rescue centers, the rescue centers don't only have a mandate to rehabilitate animals, they have a mandate to release animals too. And with big-headed turtles in particular, this can be quite difficult to rehabilitate these animals because, as I mentioned, they're highly territorial. They need to be kept individually, and they have a low tolerance to high temperatures, and they need very good water quality. And so this raises lots of issues with maintaining these turtles in captivity. And without exit strategies, it means that more and more turtles will accumulate in these rescue centres. Resources will become increasingly stretched, and there could be a resulting animal welfare issue. And so there is a pressure to release turtles, and they also have a conservation value. So our project aims to develop a process to account for some of these risks, look at the genetics of the turtles being traded, the pathogens that they may have, and to try and mitigate this risk, translocate the animals and monitor the animals. And maybe this sounds quite basic, but it's the first time this has ever been attempted for turtles in the region. So the way we're working is we have Ha, who I introduced earlier. He's our Edge Fellow, and he's managing every aspect of this program and in charge of implementing it. And we're working to improve conditions for turtles in the Turtle Conservation Centre in Cuc Phuong National Park. And we've been working to identify a molecular lab to look at the genetic samples to see which subspecies are traded, and also providing samples so that they can do molecular diagnostic work to identify pathogens that are known to be significant causes of disease in turtles. So I think we're looking at mycoplasma and herpes virus, and then to provide the protocols for the molecular biologists to do all of this work in Vietnam. And so here's Ha processing one of many big-headed turtles. He's taking a cloacal swab, which will be analysed for pathogens. And then he has the model to actually identify the release site for the turtles. And this is quite a complicated process. It involves engaging with the local community to understand their perceptions of turtles and how they use them and whether they currently still collect them from the wild. It involves working with local protected area rangers so that their presence at the release site may deter illegal activity, and it also builds capacity within the protected area management team. He looks for turtles to see whether there are any present at the release site, and finally, if there are any turtles that are present at sites, he will take pathogen samples so we can start understanding what diseases or pathogens that turtles may have in the wild. And all of this information can then be used to select the most appropriate site for the turtles to be released. And a subset of the released turtles are then attaches a radio transponder to them, and he tracks the turtles over time and assesses their health. So some of the results so far is that HAR has found big-headed turtles present at some of the proposed release sites, and that he's been able with the team to identify which subspecies are traded and seized at the Turtle Conservation Centre, which can inform regional law enforcement priorities. He's gathered the first ever pathogen screening data for wild turtles, which is a really important baseline that can be used later to inform translocations. And he's identified that, yes, some of the turtles that have been screened do have mycoplasma and herpes virus. And then through a qualitative risk assessment known as a disease risk analysis, the risk that infectious and non-infectious diseases pose during and following a translocation can be analysed and mitigated. So this disease risk analysis process has been undertaken on these particular pathogens, mycoplasma and herpes virus. And it's been deemed that mycoplasma are probably commensal parasites and that the herpes virus is probably not a herpes virus. So that was really good news. A lot of work went into kind of getting all this data. And as a result, HAR and the team have been able to release 141 big-headed turtles into protected areas in Vietnam. These animals have been seized from the illegal wildlife trade. And here's HAR, he's radio tracking one of the released turtles. And during the radio telemetry fieldwork, he's looking at the distance animals move, he's looking at the habitats they're selecting, the temperatures that they're exposed to. And all of this data can then inform the management of turtles in rescue centres. And he's also looking at the weights of turtles over time and taking follow-up pathogen samples. And this is the first ever post-release monitoring of turtles that have been translocated after being seized from the illegal wildlife trade. So there's huge opportunities to learn and refine techniques. So there are some limitations with our work. We're only screening for a couple of pathogens, and there are many more. And that this model itself is highly costly, not just sort of the molecular work for the pathogen screening, but the genetic screening, and then that huge amount of effort to spend in the field looking for the turtles afterwards. But what this does show is that by approaching things in this way, highly threatened turtles are being released back into Vietnam's protected areas. So we have a conservation gain potentially. And also, again, for animal welfare, there's exit strategies for animals and rescue centres. And what's really encouraging is that this model that's been developed by the team and many other people inputting into it, it can be used on other taxa that are housed in Vietnam's crowded and overstocked rescue centres, so things like pangolins, potentially small carnivores. And to this end, we had a really good disease risk analysis workshop in April 2019, led by the Institute of Zoology's Tony Sainsbury at Cook Phong National Park, where we worked with many rescue centres to introduce the concept. And what's really encouraging is that other organisations are already using these methods on other translocations in Vietnam. And finally, just to kind of link this back to the zoo where I'm based, we have an exhibit that showcases this project. So we house 4 big-headed turtles that were seized from the illegal wildlife trade in Canada. They were being traded for the exotic pet trade. So come to the zoo to see the turtles and learn more about the project. Just want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the huge number of people that have been involved in this work and our funders. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. There are so many questions that have come through, so we are going to try and cover as many as possible in the next sort of 5-10 minutes. But one for you, Ben, is have there been any difficulties tracking these released turtles?
I haven't actually been out there tracking them myself, so I've just in the rescue centres, but I know from HAR that the terrain in particular is really, really quite challenging. As I mentioned in the introduction to the talk, these turtles live in really high mountains, in fast-flowing streams, kind of associated with waterfalls. So there's been a lot of climbs up waterfalls with ropes and kind of crash hats on to kind of make sure they're doing things safely. So that's probably one of the largest challenges, actually working in that terrain itself. And the turtles themselves are actually they're not huge, and they can kind of go into very small rock crevices, so they can be quite difficult to detect, even when you've got a radio signal.
They don't always make it easy for people trying to track them.
That's the fun of it, I guess.
There's another question we've had for you, Ben, which is, why do you think over-exploitation of reptiles increased so much in the last 10 to 20 years? And this is referring to the dramatic reduction in freshwater turtles in China.
I guess it's difficult to say because I'm not sure that we actually have really good historic data set to track things over time. But yes, there has been a significant recognition that the trade in that a lot of animals have been traded from mainland Southeast Asia going into China, and that's probably because that a lot of the animals, a lot of populations of wildlife has disappeared in China, but there's a high demand for wildlife in China. So it's, you know, that demand has repercussions across international borders.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic, thank you. Right, we've got some more questions and I'm going to ask everyone to turn their mics and cameras back on. Although, Ben, I'm going to stick with you to see whether you've got a response to this question, because it actually came in quite early on. And because you admitted at the beginning that you work quite a lot with amphibians and, you know, not always so much with reptiles, I wondered if you had a response for this, because the question is, how do we get regular folk to care about reptiles when obviously some of them have such a bad reputation? So for you, Ben, what do you think it is that we can say or do to convince people that reptiles are great?
I think it's not kind of perpetuating a lot of myths about reptiles. It's about seeing them in a new light. And, you know, some of the facts that came through, I think most people hearing that a turtle breathes through its bum or something, that's really cool. So it's promoting that positive association with people at a young age, not always vilifying reptiles because they perform some really vital roles for us. So I think it's promoting the cool things about reptiles rather than them being something to be afraid of. That's my personal take, and I'm sure that others on the panel have some other thoughts.
Sounds like a good way to try and convince people. Anyone else got any comments? Or do you all agree? Just go with the cool stuff.
Totally agree with Ben. I think one of the coolest things I've seen in the past few years was that Planet Earth feature of the marine iguanas and the racer snakes. And I mean, that more of that, please. Just showing how awesome these spectacles are. I mean, reptiles are just fascinating.
Yeah, and sometimes perhaps it's just people just aren't aware. Emmanuel, I've got another question for you that's come through from someone who's really impressed by THRESCOAL's work, but asked sort of what alternative livelihoods you are creating for local people as part of this project.
Okay, so what we are trying to do is, first people want to do as an alternative livelihood. So as part of my Segri Survivor and then Rainforest Trust feasibility study, we are engaging the people at the first stage to identify the kind of livelihood that they want. So currently we are engaging to identify the kind of livelihood they want. Something that you brought it, we don't like it, we decided to bring it here. So we want to engage them first, establish what they want, then we start rolling it. Yeah. So that's what we are doing. We are doing feasibility study. Yeah.
Brilliant, and brilliant to find out what people want, what they want to be involved in, and then take it from there. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Another question that's come through, which was proving pretty popular, is given there are a large number of species we lack sufficient data on, how many reptiles do you think are yet to be discovered? Do you think there are lots of undiscovered species out there? Anyone got any thoughts on that?
I mean,
or have we found them all? What do you think, Rikki?
I mean, yeah, there's going to be a lot of species that we haven't found. And one of the bigger worries is there's going to be a lot of species that we haven't found that are going to be gone before we even get to see them. I know you can cross Madagascar, I know Ben's been as well, and you see all of these tracts of forest that would have been there. And we know about all these micro-endemic chameleons and geckos that live in, small patches of forest on hillsides. like all of these species, you know, we could have already lost hundreds or thousands of reptile species before we even got to see what they were. So, I mean, there's probably, you know, plenty more species to discover, but there's also, I mean, I always end up putting a negative spin on things. There's also probably many species that we've already lost that we'll never know about as well.
Mm. We have had a really popular question come through, but it's not one we're actually able to really comment on this evening because it's to do with UK reptiles. So thank you for asking that. I'm sorry, but we're not really in a position to comment. As you have probably realised, we're talking a lot about projects overseas, but perhaps that's a topic for a future event. But the next most popular question is about habitat restoration and whether that is proving useful for endangered reptiles, or is it hard to measure? Like how successful is habitat restoration? Anyone able to comment on that?
I could give a go.
Go for it.
The few projects that I know about, but there's been some quite good programs in Mauritius focusing on offshore islands. So Mauritius used to have a very rich reptile fauna. But with the arrival of Europeans and a lot of the pest species that they brought with them, many reptiles there kind of became extinct on the mainland, and they just survived on these tiny little pockets. And then there were issues on these islands with introduced feral species as well. So things like boats had totally trashed the habitat there, and many of the reptiles that had gone extinct on mainland of Mauritius were kind of clinging on these tiny, small islands. And it was only after these predators were, so the things like goats and rats were removed, that habitat was able to recover. And I think, though, there's some data to show that the reptile populations have then increased in response. And now looking forward, it's about replacing some of those ecosystem engineers that have been lost from that region. So there were giant tortoises endemic to that part of the world, and they're really important seed dispersers. So using kind of analog species from other parts of the world, so from the Seychelles, there's a giant tortoise still living, or radiated tortoises from Madagascar, and then using those species to restore that ecosystem. So that's on a very small scale. It's on an island scale where it's easier, I guess, to control things and restore habitats. I'm personally unaware of, if we're talking globally, of any large scale habitat restoration projects where the impact on reptile populations has been kind of quantified.
Yeah, I think most evidence that we have comes from these kind of very discrete, where we know about what the habitat should look like and what the species needs, and hence we can implement it much more easily.
But positive though, which is good. So hopefully
Absolutely.
it can be expanded. Right, we're coming towards the end of the event. I think Emmanuel, we might have lost him momentarily, but hopefully he's back with us. I'm choosing a question that came in very near the beginning of the event, but I think it probably echoes some of the other questions that have been asked, because a lot of people have been asking things like, how can I get more involved? I'd really like to become a zookeeper, and really interested in yes, the part they can play. I will say there's a lot of information on our website, www.zsl.org, so do have a look on that. But in the meantime, does anyone have any comments on the best way to help with conservation projects, and I quote, when you're skint? How can people get involved when they don't necessarily have the money to be able to afford to go off on all sorts of exciting overseas travel? Is there anything that they can still do and get involved with?
I think one way that's relatively cheap to do, and it goes back to what Ben said about how we can really make reptiles kind of, well, demystify reptiles or speak up for reptiles. It's just, just wax lyrically about them to your friends. Really try and get rid of some of these stigmas that are around some of these species, because they are wonderful. They are just great. Particularly things like snakes, I absolutely love. I have no idea why they seem to have such a bad reputation. I'm really sad now. I was going to go and put a lovely picture in my presentation of 2 adders in the UK, which I think is just the best snake species in the world, is our very own adder. And I think just promoting that they're awesome is one way that we can all help.
Absolutely. Doesn't cost any money to
Precisely.
help sort of spread the word about how great reptiles are. And Ben?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that there are plenty of organisations within the UK. Obviously, ZSL is a great conservation organisation that you should support, but there are national kind of British Herpetological Society. If you're really interested in reptiles and amphibians, they run kind of free lecture events, and you can also subscribe to their journal, and you may be able to get involved through kind of networking with people to actually get out there and help kind of, I guess, manage habitat in the UK for native reptiles and amphibians. So looking at home as well and working in the field in the UK is really cool. It's enjoyable.
Definitely some of the best snakes, according to Moni. And any other comments, Rikki? Do you concur? Do you think those are good ways to get involved?
Yeah, I think definitely getting involved in your local organisations in the UK is something that is very easily done, but very easily overlooked because, you know, it's always cold and wet. It's very hard to see reptiles a lot of the time. But as Moni said, you know, grass snakes and especially adders are fantastic animals to see. So not giving any love to the lizards, but, you know, sand lizards, you know, we've got some fantastic species in the UK that you can see. And if you want to make a difference in terms of, you know, all threatened species around the world, you know, you can be more conscious about what you're consuming at the minute around the planet, and you know that doesn't cost anything, hopefully, to be more conscious about what you're consuming and your impact on the planet more widely. And if you love snakes and lizards, make sure the pets that you have are coming from the wild.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. I think, Emmanuel, we've got you back, which is great, because I'd like to thank you and Moni, Rikki and Ben for brilliant talks this evening, and for answering all of those questions as well. I'm sorry we weren't able to cover more. And thank you also to Ellie Darbey, who's been working behind the scenes to make sure that everything ran smoothly tonight. Thank you, of course, to all of you who are viewing, for joining us this evening and for all of your fantastic questions. I'm just going to share my screen with you one final time, because if I can get it to come up, here we go. I'd really like to share that Survey Monkey link, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we really value your comments. We'd love to hear your ideas about things we could be covering in the future, maybe different ways we could be running the event, what you thought of it. So please, if you have just a few minutes to fill out the Survey Monkey, we would really appreciate it. The address is www.surveymonkey.com/r/ZSL event 3. Now, I don't know whether this is your first time watching or whether you've joined us for previous events, but this is a monthly series. So our next event will be on Tuesday, the 12th of January, where the topic will be changing again to Revealing the Unseen, the Amazing World of Wildlife Pathology. So please do join us then if you can. Full details for that event and all of the other events coming up in the series are at zsl.org/science/events. And of course, on that website, you can find out more about our work, ways you can support us, perhaps by donating or by becoming a fellow, but also ways you can get involved in some of our conservation projects here in the UK. So if you'd like to know more, please do go to our website. But for now, thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again in the future. Bye-bye.